Hello everyone, my name is Joanna Malinowska. Today I'm gonna talk about the need to revise the way we interpret and use the concept of racism in biomedical research and healthcare. Why this is an important issue? Every year more and more publications about racism and health are being published, and this number is rising very quickly. To be honest, it would be very easy to just pick a few badly written papers that don't even define the concept of racism or define it in a very weird way and criticize them. Yet I decided not to do so, and I wanted to say a few words about the brilliant series about impact of intersecting forms of discrimination on people's health that was recently published in The Lancet. While those papers are very thoughtful and very deep when it comes to the recognition of variety forms of discrimination, yet they define racism in a very narrow way. So racism is interpreted there as an organized system that affords power and privilege according to an established hierarchy based on racial categories. But what is this established racial hierarchy based on racial categories? This is not a surprise that the most influential ethno-racial classification was developed in the USA. And this is the ethno-racial classification proposed by Office of Management and the Budget that recognize 5 races and 2 ethnicities. And while we already know that each community develops its own ethno-racial hierarchy, classification, and their own understanding of race and ethnicity, yet the US race stock somehow spill over to the mainstream ethno-racial imagination, as well as to the way how researchers understand and use ethno-racial categories in their studies. And because this most powerful post-colonial ethno-racial narration affects people's imagination so deeply, then usually when discrimination is being analyzed and when racism is being analyzed in terms of its impact on people's health, then discrimination based on features such as language or religion is usually out of the picture. And from my point of view, this is a huge problem, because while majority of researchers already acknowledge that race and ethnicity are a strictly sociocultural construct, yet by associating racism with race, and race with, as it is defined in the Lancet series, someone's actual or perceived physical appearance and ancestry or ethno-racial identity, those analyses somehow make our understanding of races more essentialist, and they go back to very essentialist and a narrow definition of race and ethnicity. But people's ethno-racial identities are not fixed, they can change, and many factors influence how we recognize ourselves and how we feel about our ethno-racial identity and how we recognize others. It depends on environment. Any change in environment, for example, migration, can affect our ethno-racial identity. The change of our income can change our ethno-racial identity. And this is why I really prefer to use the concept of racialization instead of race and ethnicity to study the effect of racial oppression on health. And by racialization, I understand a continuous process operating through several pathways and their complex interaction, by which an individual comes to be understood by others, as well as recognize themselves, which is really important, as a representative of a major biological entity and a human lineage formed due to reproductive isolation, in which membership is transmitted through biological descent. And those pathways include environmental and sociocultural processes, or, for example, epigenetical and neuronal processes that affect the current state of a person's racialization. The concept of racialization gives us much more intuition about why and how very different features can be subject to biologization and essentialization, and thus acquire racial meaning or racial quality, as noted by Levitsky. This is because this perspective is much more intersectional, processual, and contextual. It gives us the feeling that we don't deal with something that is fixed and universal and something that is objective. as noted by Miles and Brown. Conceiving of racism in terms of the phenotypical distinctiveness of victims alone leads to a poverty of conceptualizing racism. Similarly to the situation when we interpret race as something that has a biological meaning. In this place, it's important to add that some researchers propose to use a concept of xenoracism to discuss the situations when people are being racialized, but not in terms of the color of their skin, but for example, in terms of their language or nationality. And I was really struggling when thinking about this proposition. My first impulse was to say, yes, of course, we should differentiate between racism and oppression that is based on different forms of racialization. But then maybe it's another trap based on the fact that our thinking about racism is permitted by essentialist and colonial narration that we automatically replicated in most of our discussions about racial disparities. Maybe this is another situation when we just straighten this colonial and racist narrative. Maybe we should actually underline that race is not real. Of course, racialization is real and people have those racial identities, but race itself is not real. And it can be understood, it can be interpreted, depending on situation, on many different factors. And I really believe that because of such essentialist understanding of racism, many groups that experienced racial oppression, as well as many processes that shapes inequalities in health, are still unrecognized by researchers. And here I would like to move on to discuss the problem of racialization of Central and Eastern Europeans. As noted by Ivan Kalmar in his great book White But Not Quite, through ages, individual groups were negotiating their whiteness and becoming white or losing their white privileges, depending on factors like context, their relations with others, etc. And that also happened in mostly white communities. And I want to very strongly underline that I'm not saying that situation of racialized whites who had no full access to white privilege can be equated with a very brutal discrimination of people of color, because even racialized whites have always had a better position in the global racial hierarchies than racialized people of color, as well as develop racial narratives against other minorities such as Roma, such as Muslims, such as Jewish communities, such as people of color, and such as other whites. And this is why the situation in Europe and situation between different communities in Europe is so complicated and so difficult to understand if we try to do so using US ethno-racial classifications and this very popular understanding of racism. So let's have a quick look on the history of racial oppression. Actually, the notion of purity of blood emerged in the context of religion-based racialization of Jews and Muslims in Iberian Peninsula, who were deprived of certain rights, for example, employment or property, which was given only to authentic Christian believers. Another example of racialization of some white communities is the fact that Slavs, population inhabiting mainly Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe, were also enslaved by conquering peoples, especially in 10th and 11th century. And what's interesting, some researchers argue that trading them was carried on such a large scale that the name Slavs became the origin of the word slave. Another interesting fact is how different narratives and different stories were used to justify trading different groups of people and enslaving different groups of people through ages. One of such stories was the curse of Ham, based on Old Testament, about Noah's son Ham, whose descendants were supposed to be enslaved and work for others. So through history, non-Christians were considered descendants of Ham, blacks were considered descendants of Ham, then Slavs were considered the descendants of Ham, for example, by people from Western Europe. And what is a great argument that the racialization is so strongly related with different intersectional forms of oppression is the fact that in Slavic communities, particularly in Poland, Polish peasants were also considered the descendants of Ham by Polish nobilities. So this was a very intriguing situation when a community that was already racialized by others developed their own racial or pseudo-racial hierarchy to enslave and to exploit others. And to do so, they used the same tools like Curse of Ham and some pseudo-scientific tools to justify the situation. For example, in 16th century Poland, a view spread that peasants were a different race, born to just work, that they had a very thick skin and a very strong, very thick nerves that protected them from feeling pain. And what is particularly interesting, that their skull bones resembled agricultural tools in shape. So this was interpreted as the fact that they are born to work. But this is not only some short period of a dark history of Europe, but the situation that has its effect nowadays, and it's still developing, as noted by researchers such as Krivonos, Kalmar, Lewicki, Narkowicz, and Rzepnikowska, and many more, because there is more and more researchers that analyze the processes of racialization that are not based on a skin tone. And it's not only in Europe, there are also studies about racialization, processes of racialization among Asians, for example, in South Korea. But when it comes to Europe, those researchers are stating that within the contemporary European hierarchy, Eastern Europeans are imagined somewhere in between whiteness and blackness. And the stereotypes about Eastern Europeans include those that they are a lesser breed, they are carriers of disease, specifically skilled manual workers, a strain on public services, that they are all alcoholics, that they are tricksters, that they are dirtier. So as you can see, those features are so similar to those that were somehow prescribed to stereotypes, like included in a bag of stereotypes about people of color. And the positioning of Europe's East as a place where people are treated just as some reservoir of cheap labor shapes the whole situation in our region. It's not just the fact that many people moved to other countries and that they are experiencing racialization and racial oppression there, but it's also about their families. It's also about the development of their towns and villages and cities. It's also about the development of relations of different communities and groups of different migrants in certain regions. So this is actually a very complex story that needs to be analyzed and that needs to be studied, and that also affects people's health and also is a part of problems with health disparities in Europe. Now I will quickly move to the last part of my presentation about so-called East-West health gap in Europe. This term relates to the fact that there is quite a significant difference between life expectancy between East European and West European countries that happily started to shrink after 90s, yet Eastern Europe still has some way to catch up with the West. So here is the map showing the differences in life expectancy at birth and at 65 years. As you can easily notice, those countries that representatives have a longer life expectancy are marked with the darker colors, and those with a shorter life expectancy are marked with the lighter colors. And as you see, East European countries, here we see only those countries that are a part of European Union, but those Central Eastern European countries have a significantly shorter life expectancy. And this situation is strongly correlated with economical inequalities in Europe, especially with differences in income between different countries, as well as different amount of money spent on health and healthcare in those countries. And because the economical situation in Central Eastern Europe as well as Southern Europe is much worse than in west of Europe, the investigation in health are still on a too low level, and many people need to spend a lot of money out of their pocket to pay for access to healthcare. Yet this only strengthens the health inequalities in the region as well as other types of inequalities, especially economical inequalities. This also affects the availability of healthcare in those countries that are less privileged and struggle economically. For example, here you can see the differences when it comes to availability of PET scanners in European Union. Here is the number of magnetic resonance imaging. As you see, there is a huge difference between Eastern as well as Central Eastern and some Southern Eastern European countries and European West. Practicing caring personnel, and this is actually a huge and very complex problem because in countries such as Poland, we have a lot of people studying medicine. However, most of them migrate to other countries, and not only because of economical reasons, but also because of political reasons. They just don't want to live in a country that is so illiberal as Poland at the moment. And last example, a number of psychiatrists in Eastern European countries compared to other places in Europe. And I would like to add that in many cases I see statistics showing that countries such as Poland have a much lower level of people diagnosed as having depression or suffering from anxiety. And this is actually very funny because of course we have a lower number of people struggling with depression that are recognized by the system, simply because it is almost impossible to get a visit with a psychologist or psychiatrist in my country. So what are the reasons of such a significant health gap in Europe, and why I discuss it in the context of racism? This is because I strongly believe that some of those differences are caused by a long-standing racialization of Central and Eastern Europeans that is transmitted through many pathways, epigenetical pathways. For example, many people are traumatized. Many people have close ancestors who are heavily traumatized during or after World War II. And because of such a low access to psychologists and psychiatrists, they never recovered, and they are passing their trauma through generations. It's also passed environmentally by exploitation of the region that is usually treated as a place to build production and magazines and a place to look for a cheap workforce. It is transmitted socioculturally by lower levels of funding education, distrust in science and practitioners because of the long-lasting occupation, and distrust to governments that was, for example, caused by Soviet occupation. There are many different processes and different pathways through which racialization can and could in the past affect people's health in Eastern Europe, and that could cause, at least to some point, differences in health between East and West of Europe. And I think that to understand those processes and to understand those pathways, we should use the concept of racism, because without it, we lack the full picture. And this is especially important now when we face humanitarian crisis at our borders, when different minority groups in Europe are being racialized, and those processes of racialization change from month to month, like in Polish borders, when one groups of migrants are welcomed with open arms and others are trying to get to pass through the border and losing their lives in forest or on the wall that was recently built on the border. It's important because different communities are facing aggression and racialization that affect their health, and they are completely they have no access to healthcare, like in many cases Roma people and illegal migrants. It is also important in the face of war in Ukraine, which changes the situation and potentially can deepen the health crisis in Eastern Europe, as well as may straighten the processes of racialization, as well as disparities between European East and West. So we have to act now, and we have to think together how to revise our understanding of the concept of racism to be reliable, but also to include all of those processes that are usually invisible to science. Thank you very much.